Okay, welcome to our first writing lesson where we are going to be introduced to our fairy tale writing unit, which is super exciting. I cannot wait to share this with you all. So let's jump into our fairy tale writing unit. First question is, what is a fairy tale? Some of us may have heard this word before, some of us might know what it is. A fairy tale is a magical story that can have all types of creatures. They're usually stories that begin with once upon a time. So whenever you hear someone telling a story or you're reading a story and it starts with once upon a time, it's most likely going to be a fairy tale. Some of the creatures that fairy tales can have, there's talking animals, princesses, princes, somebody could be casting a spell, it could be, the setting could be in a faraway land that doesn't really exist. There's evil queens, trolls, goblins, there's lots of different magical creatures that are in fairy tales that make fairy tales what they are. The most important word to remember is magical. Fairy tales are stories that are not real. They're fiction stories, but they're not just fiction. They always have some type of magic happening. And these magical stories, they've been passed down through generations. So the fairy tales that we're going to look at today are the same fairy tales that my mom told me. They're the same fairy tales that my grandmom told my mom and told my dad when they were growing up. But each time there can be a few changes made. So whoever's writing the fairy tale, they might make a few little changes here and there to make the story their own. But fairy tales have been passed down from many, many people. So before we read a fairy tale together, I want you to think to yourself, what are some fairy tales I know and can think of? I can think of a couple. Thinking of stories that are magical, they have talking animals, princesses. I can think of a few, but we're going to read one together today. And some other examples. Together we're going to read Cinderella. This is a story that a lot of people might know, but it's a really good example of a fairy tale. So here's the cover of our book, Cinderella. It is retold by Sarah L. Thompson, and it's illustrated by Nicoletta. And it's really important that we understand retold. Retold means that this author didn't create Cinderella. Cinderella is a fairy tale that's been around for a long, long, long time. They just retold the story in their own words. Maybe they made a couple changes, so we'll have to see. So Cinderella. Once upon a time, a rich merchant lived with his daughter. He loved the girl for her beautiful face and her sweet heart, but after his wife died, he decided to marry a second time, and his new wife was selfish and cruel. She had 2 daughters of her own who were just like her. The stepmother forced her stepdaughter to wash the pots and pans, scrub the floors, and tend the fire. The poor girl did not even have a bed of her own, but lay by the hearth every night and rose in the morning covered with cinders. So her stepsisters called her Cinderella. Cinders are little pieces that come off of a fire, like ash, and so she would wake up covered in those cinders. One day, the king sent word that he would hold a grand ball. There, the prince would choose a wife. I shall wear my red velvet with the lace, declared the older stepsister. I'll wear my satin with the golden flowers, said the younger one. Cinderella gathered up her courage to ask a question. Can't I, she said. Hand me my stockings, said the older stepsister. May I, said Cinderella. Tie this ribbon in my hair, said the younger stepsister. Please, can I go to the ball? Asked Cinderella. Certainly not, said her stepmother. And the stepmother and stepsisters swept off in their carriage to the castle, leaving Cinderella alone. Cinderella sat by the fire. A gentle voice asked, Why are you crying? Cinderella jumped up. There in the kitchen stood a woman with the kindest face she had ever seen. "Don't worry, my dear," the woman said. "I am your fairy godmother, and I will send you to the ball." "But godmother," said Cinderella, "I have no carriage or horses or even a gown to wear." "Never fear," said the godmother, "and bring me a pumpkin from the garden." Bewildered, Cinderella picked a plump orange pumpkin. The godmother touched the pumpkin with the magic of her wand, and it turned into an elegant coach. The magic turned 6 mice into 6 prancing horses, 2 lizards into 2 proud footmen, and a rat into a plump coachman. When the wand brushed Cinderella's rags, she was dressed in a pale blue velvet and silver satin. On her feet were a pair of glass slippers, delicate as icicles. "You are dressed like a queen," said her godmother. "Behave like one as well. Be kind and courteous to all you meet, and leave the ball before midnight, or everything that my spells have created will vanish." Cinderella promised to come home by midnight and rode off to the ball. When Cinderella walked into the ballroom, the fiddlers paused on their strings. The dancers craned their necks to see her. The prince bowed low and asked her to dance. Whispers raced through the crowd. "She must be a princess from some foreign land. How gracefully she dances! What a sweet smile! Why, the prince can't keep his eyes off her." But Cinderella remembered her godmother's words. Before midnight, she curtsied to the prince and hurried out the door. Just as Cinderella's coach rolled up in front of her house, the church clock struck 12 times. Cinderella found herself in rags once more, sitting on a pumpkin with mice and lizards and a big rat at her feet. The next night, the king held another ball. Cinderella's godmother set her in a gown of white silk, sparkling with diamonds, and the same glass slippers. The prince danced with no one else. "But please," he begged, "won't you tell me your name?" Cinderella hesitated, and the clock struck the first stroke of midnight. Cinderella spilled from the prince's arms and ran toward the door. "Wait," he cried, running after her. But when he looked outside, the beautiful princess was now nowhere to be found. He could see nothing but a shabby little servant girl with a pumpkin in her arms. On the steps was one of the glass slippers. When Cinderella's stepsisters arrived home, they were full of stories about the mysterious princess. "The prince swears he'll bring that slipper to every home in the kingdom," exclaimed the younger stepsister, "and he'll marry the woman whose foot fits into it." "Well," said the elder one, "that woman will be me." "No," said the younger, "me." The next day, the prince arrived. A servant followed him, carrying the glass slipper. The elder stepsister sat on a stool. She shoved and pushed until she cried, but she could not get her foot into the shoe. The younger stepsister tried next. She wiggled and twisted until she sobbed, but her foot would not fit either. Then the prince heard a quiet voice asking, "May I try too?" "Get back to your kitchen," cried the stepmother. But the prince remembered Cinderella's voice and her gentle eyes and her sweet smile. He knelt and slipped the shoe on Cinderella's foot. He was not surprised when she drew the matching slipper from her pocket and placed it on the other foot. "You are the princess I danced with," he said. "I knew it the minute I saw you." Cinderella and the prince were married, and as soon as the wedding feast could be prepared, and Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, invited her stepsisters and her stepmother to the wedding. Her stepmother was too out of sorts to dance, and as for the stepsisters, their feet were too sore from trying on the slipper. It was weeks before they had recovered enough to dance even a jig. But Cinderella and her prince lived happily ever after. So that's the story of Cinderella. So what we're going to do is, I really wanted you to pay attention to the details in this story, because for your assignment today in writing, you're gonna retell some of the story. You're gonna have a chart that looks just like this. In your 4 boxes, the first box, you're gonna set up the story. I want you to type in what is gonna happen in the story. Don't tell us everything, but set it up for us. What's the beginning? What's happening in the beginning? Maybe who are some of our characters? Set us up until we get to our trouble or motivation. So we don't want to tell the whole story here, but we want to tell a little bit. Our next box is our characters and setting. So we're going to tell who is in the story and where it's taking place. The third box is our trouble or motivation. So this is similar to our problem in a fiction story, but in fairy tales, we like to call it the character's trouble or their motivation, why they want, hold on, sorry. So when we talk about characters' trouble or motivation, it's why they are doing something. So it's either the problem and then how they're trying to solve their problem. And once I get the chart back up, the last box is called resolution. This is how our character solves their problem. How does the story end? Usually with fairy tales, just like we had with Cinderella, it ends with happily ever after, and the characters have their problem solved, and everyone that is in the story is happy and excited. So let's look at the example of me filling out the box with Cinderella. Once this loads. There we go. Okay, scroll down. Almost there. Thank you for being patient and waiting. Woo! Okay, so when we talk about setting up the story, I'm gonna read to you what I wrote for how I set up the story. So when we set up the story, I wrote that Cinderella lives with the stepsisters and her stepmother. They do not treat her nicely. She has to clean the whole house. One day, a fairy godmother comes and lets Cinderella go to the ball where she meets the prince. So I set up the story. I didn't tell you everything that happened, but I gave you a good idea of what's probably or could happen. For our characters and setting, I just typed a list of everyone who's in the story. Cinderella, evil stepmother, evil stepsisters, the prince, fairy godmother, Cinderella's mice and lizards, who were then turned into the horses for her carriage. Now let's look at the trouble and motivation. So the trouble is that Cinderella is only allowed at the ball until midnight. At midnight, her pretty dress goes away and so does her carriage. She leaves her shoe at the ball and the prince must find who the shoe belongs to in order to find Cinderella. So that our problem was that she had to leave at midnight. She had to run out of that prince's arms, but while she was running away, her shoe got left behind. And the prince knew if he found whose shoe that was, he would find Cinderella. So our trouble was that the clock struck midnight and she had to go. That motivated the prince to find her. And our story ends with the prince comes to Cinderella's house and the shoe fits her. And just like in most of our fairy tales, they live happily ever after. So what you're going to do is, in the next couple slides, there are all different fairy tales. I want you to take a look. You can watch all the fairy tales. You can watch 2 of them. You can pick one to watch. I want you to watch the fairy tales on YouTube. They're read-alouds from YouTube. And you're going to pick one story. Once you pick out your story, you're going to fill out the chart that I just filled out. And when we get back on tomorrow, we're going to talk about how everyone's charts may look a little bit different. Maybe they'll have some details, maybe they'll have a lot of details. Maybe some people will focus on one part of the motivation, and someone might focus on something else for the motivation and trouble. So everyone's chart might be a little bit different, but that is okay. That is okay. So what you're gonna do, you're gonna watch the fairy tales on the next slides, you're gonna pick one story, and you're gonna fill out your chart, and you're done your writing for today. Can't wait to read what you write.